Everyone.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm so happy that you're here and here to help me welcome a brilliant writer, Steve. I practiced so hard,
I
Steve.
know, don't let me down. Eoannou.
Eoannou.
There you go.
Eoannou.
Oh, really?
Whom I have the privilege of
Eoannou.
introducing this
Close
evening.
enough.
Eoannou. Steve is a first-generation Greek-American, a UB graduate with a degree in communications and an MA in English from Miami University. And then I'm thinking later in life, correct? Steve earned an MFA in creative writing from Queen's University in Charlotte, in North Carolina.
Okay.
I'm going to read some awards you won, if you
Okay.
don't mind. Okay.
No, I like hearing that.
Okay, great. Steve earned an honor certificate from the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators from a short story that was part of the book Muscle Cars.
Yep.
It was published separately in a magazine called Yarn. Best Short Screenplay Award at the 26 Stars Denver Film Festival. Maybe you'll fill us in on that a little later on. Santa Fe Writers Project Literary Award Program winner, and the 2021 Island Award for Historical Fiction. Lastly, his book After Pearl, which has not yet been published, but will be coming out
In 2025.
in 2025, was a 2022 Claymore Award finalist. So congratulations
Thank
on
you.
all of that. This is Steve's third visit with us. The first time we featured his book Muscle Cars, which is a collection of short stories, which I just mentioned. The second time was during COVID when Steve zoomed in with his absolutely brilliant and wonderfully entertaining first novel, Rook, which is a fascinating true story about Al Nussbaum, a Buffalonian who robbed banks in New York City while living the quiet life in our fair city here in Buffalo, New York. He went to jail for a murder. Did he commit the murder or was just an accomplice?
He was an accomplice. He was the wheelman.
I thought so. And there, while incarcerated, he became a writer himself. He wrote stories for TV, anthologies, and a novel of his own. But tonight, as part of the launch of his new book, Steve is here to talk about Yesteryear, a story about Fran Striker, the creator of Green Hornet, Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, and none other than the Lone Ranger. So please join me in welcoming Steve this evening.
Yeah.
So my first question is probably the first question everybody asks you. And how did you come upon Fran Striker and his connection to the Lone Ranger?
Well, like all good stories, it started in a bar. At least I think it did. I was either at a bar or a party, and someone making conversation mentioned that the man who wrote The Lone Ranger was from Buffalo. And I said, no, that can't be right. I would have known about that. Buffalo-based writer. The city's really good about promoting all the creative people who are from here or have some connection to Buffalo. Can't be true. And of course, I Googled it, and not only was he a Buffalo guy, but he was a neighborhood guy. I was living here in the Elmwood Village, and he went to Lafayette High School. He wrote The Lone Ranger over on Granger Place. So he was a neighborhood guy, and I never heard of him. And I had a friend from high school who was the school nurse, Noni, at Lafayette. And I asked her, I said, can you look around? Is there like a plaque near the stage or the office, about Fran Striker? And she goes, no, there's nothing there. She looked for me. Okay. I asked, my parents were still alive when I had started the book, and they didn't remember him either. I said, well, how come no one knows about this guy? And so I did some more research, and that's when I found out that Fran sold the rights to the Lone Ranger for $10 before the Lone Ranger just exploded into this money-making machine that's lasted 90 years. And then I did some more research, and I found out the man he sold it to, a man named George W. Trendle, who owned WXYZ in Detroit, where the Lone Ranger was broadcast from in the 30s, started claiming in interviews and articles that he wrote and created the Lone Ranger, not Fran. And there was even a story floating around saying that Fran didn't even join the writing team at WXYZ until after the Ranger had been on the air. And so I think because of that lie that really lasted to this day, as well as him selling the rights and not missing out on all that fame, I think that's why he's not as well known as he should be. So that's a long answer to how I found out about Fran.
Just this past summer, I actually visited Lafayette High School, and the principal showed me a wall of all famous people. I don't recall if his name was there or not, but we better correct that.
Yeah, I think so.
Mistake.
Yeah. So when Lit City, down by the library on Washington Street, did their first round of hanging the banners on the lampposts, I walked down there and took a walk down Washington looking for Fran, and sure enough, he didn't have a banner. So I went home and I got on my shot off an email to the library, who forwarded on to Just Lit Buffalo, who's in charge of that, outlining why I thought Striker should have his own banner. Never heard back. But the next time they hung banners, Fran had his own banner. Not sure if my letter did any good or not, but it's there. And the ironic thing is, it's hanging right in front of the Brisbane building. And Woolworths used to be in the Brisbane building. And that was Fran's job before he went into radio and started working at WEBR. So it's kind of ironic that he gets a banner, and it's where he was, working for minimum wage back in the late 20s.
Yeah, it's a great story.
Yeah.
It really is. And speaking of talent in this area, we have actually welcomed over 90 authors to this little book club
Oh, that's
through
wonderful.
the years. Yeah.
Congratulations.
A lot of talent here in Buffalo, New York. And
Yes,
maybe Fran started it all.
maybe he did.
Yeah. I was hoping you would share a little bit more about his life growing up here in Buffalo.
Yeah, Fran was a really interesting guy. You read about authors and their lives, and they have some like trauma or tragedy, and Fran didn't have anything. From what I've read, he had a really wholesome upbringing. He loved nature. He loved the outdoors, camping, fishing, hunting, gardening. He was a joiner. He loved to join clubs and save all the membership cards that he had. He kept them in a scrapbook. So he was a joiner. In high school at Lafayette, he was in the band. He wrote for the newspaper. He was in the theater club, the chemistry club. When he went to UB, he was actually a chemistry major. And he got in trouble because he was such a joiner. He was pledging like 3 or 4 different fraternities at the same time. And he got called on it and said, "You can't do that. You got to pick one." And he goes, "How can I pick one? They're all so interesting. They're interesting guys. I want to hang out with everybody." While he was at UB, he got the bug. He got the bug for theater. He got the bug for writing. And chemistry just didn't cut it anymore. And so he dropped out of UB and actually went to New York City in the late 20s and was working for a theater company where he was exposed to directing and writing scripts and being in that professional atmosphere. He was only gone for a year, and he came back to Buffalo with the idea of breaking into the theater here in Buffalo. And this was 1929. And he was able to break into theater, but he wasn't getting paid, and that he needed to get paid because he had met his future wife and wanted to get married. So the hottest thing was radio, right? It was the new medium. And back in those days, the radio stations had their own orchestras, their own writers, their own actors, and they were producing content. And so Fran got a job at WEBR. And he did a little bit of everything. He directed shows, he produced shows, he read the news, he wrote some scripts, and then he eventually was promoted and was only concentrating on the writing aspect. Things are going great, and then the Depression hits, and he still had his job. And by this time, he had married, starting a family, and as the early years of the Depression came, more and more of his family members were losing everything in the Depression. And they were either physically moving in with Fran and his family, or he was supporting them financially. So there was about a dozen members of his family that he was supporting. So he was really a good man, I think, from what I've been able to read. I haven't read, no one's ever said anything bad about Fran that I could find. So now you fast forward to 1933, 34, actually. And yesteryear, the Lone Ranger is on the air at WXYZ. I'll go back before I get there. Before that, he was supporting all these people. So what he was doing was he was taking scripts that he'd already wrote and performed on WEBR and was sending them out to other radio stations across the country, offering them between $2 and $6 an episode as a way to make extra cash. So this is before printers and before copying machines. So he had his Remington 16 typewriter and carbon paper. And he was trying to hit the keys as hard as he could to get 2 and 3 drafts out of a single sheet of carbon paper so he could mail it out to 2 or 3 radio stations at a time. One of the radio stations was WXYZ in Detroit. That's how he met Trendle. And he was selling scripts to Trendle when he was approached to write the cowboy script. And if you go to UB at the special collections, Fran's estate donated all his papers. So there's like 30 cartons of his telegrams and manuscripts and scripts and memorabilia. And one of them was a telegram that he got saying from WXYZ saying, can you write a Western? And they said, put in all the hokum. I love that word. I want to bring it back. Put all the cowboy hokum, masked riders, girl tied to railroad tracks, 6-gun shootouts. Can you do that? And Fran said, yes, he could do it because 2 years earlier, he had written a script for WEBR called a series called Covered Wagon Days. And he took episode 10 for whatever reason and repurposed it and created the Lone Ranger with input from the folks at WXYZ. Fast forward now to 34, the Ranger's been on the air for about a year. It just got a sponsor. It was starting to take off. George W. Trendle, who was known as the miser of Motown because he was so cheap, knew of Fran's financial situation and all these family members. And so he approached them in the spring of 34 and said, because up to this point, he'd been buying Lone Ranger scripts. He was up to $7 an episode now. And he said, hey, look, we want you to move to Detroit and become part of the WXYZ team. You could be head of writing. You'll get a salary, so no more sending out scripts, a script at a time. You'll have financial security. I'll guarantee you a job throughout the Depression. You make more money than you ever had. I said, this is great. But the condition was you sell me the rights to Lone Ranger for $10. So now Fran's in a predicament. The Ranger's going good. He's never had a big national hit. He's a guy from Buffalo on WEBR, right? And now it looks like it's taking off. It's beginning syndicated. They have a sponsor. Maybe he should hold on to the rights. But on the other hand, he's got all these mouths to feed, and he's never had a hit before. So there's no guarantee that this isn't going to peter out, after another, 6 or 7 episodes. He took the deal. He signed the rights away for the Lone Ranger for $10. And of course it exploded, right? So Fran wrote all the novels, there's hardback Lone Ranger novels. He wrote all of those. He wrote the comic strips in the newspapers. He wrote the comic books. He wrote the scripts. All those are money generating activities that went to Trendle. Now think of all the toys. All that went to Trendle. And when Trendle sold the rights in 1954, he sold the rights to Lone Ranger for $3 million. Oh. A pretty good return on investment for $10, right? It all goes to Trendle. It was the biggest deal in entertainment history at that point. And all through that time, when Striker continued to work for Trendle right through this 54, when he sold the rights for that $3 million. So they had a professional relationship for 20 years. And all that time, he never complained. He never challenged him in public or private about him claiming to have been the creator. Like I said, he was a very gracious and humble man. And his family would say, like, Dad, doesn't that bother you? And Fran would always say, well, the people in radio, they know it was me. Trundle never wrote anything. And they know that. And then in one interview, somebody asked him point blank, and Franz didn't bat an eye. He said, only God creates, which is kind of a nice way of saying, well, if only God creates, that means he didn't create it either, right? I thought was kind of a clever answer. And Fran died in 1962 in a car crash, so he never had a chance to write his autobiography or tell his side of the story. And but he was very humble about it. He, like I said, he never quibbled. After the Depression, he asked for a raise because he never had one. And things were successful by this time. Lone Ranger was out, Green Hornet was out, Sergeant Preston, huge money makers. And Trundle fired him. He said, no, I'm not paying you any more money. You're done. We've got the formula. We got the secret sauce. We don't need you. And the quality of the writing of the radio shows dropped off so much. The sponsors went to Trundle and said, you got to hire Striker back or we're pulling our sponsorship. And so Trundle did. He hired him back with the raise. But he was the miser of Motown. So.
Well, you answered a couple questions.
Yeah, I rambled, sorry.
No, I'm glad you did. One of them was he really that kind that he would support his extended family?
Yeah.
The way you described in the book.
Yeah.
And he was. He
was, like I said, public figure, you always, if you do enough research, you always find something, unsavory or unlikable about a person. The only complaint I could find out about Fran is that he was a chain smoker. He smoked way too much.
Who wasn't?
Yeah, they all did. And he was a workaholic. And it drove his families and neighbors nuts because he was always pounding on his Remington 16. And he had his wife gave him a curfew where he had to stop typing because keeping people up. So he'd go to his mother-in-law's house and would work there until she kicked him out and he'd have to go back home. But he would take his typewriter on vacation, and it was estimated during the 1930s, Guinness, like the Guinness Book of World Records, estimated that he was producing between the scripts and the comic strips and the comic books, 60,000 words a week or a month. We'll say a month. That's still a lot. That's like a short novel, right? But that's how much he was constantly writing.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
And where did he die though? He died in this area, correct?
He had bought a summer place. They all during the when he moved to Detroit, he lived in Detroit full time, but he had bought a place out in Arcade, New York, because he loved the land, right? And this is where he could go to relax, where he could hunt and fish and have his gardens and apple trees, and he dubbed it Fiction Farm. And that's where he would spend his summers. And after Trundle sold the rights in 1954, he moved to Arcade full time and was living at Fiction Farm. And he was actually relocating back to Buffalo because he was going to start teaching creative writing at UB.
Oh.
And on his way, he was in a car crash and he died.
And what year was that?
1962.
And so he would have been
about 60, 62. Yeah, 60, 61.
The other part, my other question that you answered earlier on was he wasn't angry about it. He accepted it as.
He would tell people, look, I was an adult. I'm a grown man. I made the best decision I thought at the time, and I'm going to live with that. I mean, it's done. You can't take it back. It must have bothered him, certainly, especially I think, just being a writer myself, if someone else started claiming that they wrote it, not me, I think that would hurt his, creative ego a lot. But he didn't, he continued working for Trundle to the very end. So it's not like today, where he would have been on Twitter, complaining, every day about it. But he just said, hey, I made a decision, a business decision. In the book, and this is true, when you were a member of the Lone Ranger fan club, one of the things that you got as a membership was the Lone Ranger Creed, and Striker wrote it. And from everything I could tell, the creed is basically Stryker's values, what he believes. And he presented, hey, if you want to be like the Lone Ranger, live your life like this. And one of the tenets of the creed, and it's in the very beginning of the book and at the end too, it's that men should live by the rule of what is best for the greatest number. And he lived that, right? Because he sold the rights for $10 because it was the best thing to do at that time. So he thought, to take care of his family, the greater number.
Why do you think the Lone Ranger really resonated with people at that time? Do you think it had to be the idea of the masked man, someone you don't know, doing kind things for people in need and connecting to the depression?
I think it did connect to the depression, because here was this Lone Ranger who was helping people, little people, common people, who have been wronged or tried to be swindled. So that first pilot episode that he wrote based on episode number 10 of Covered Wagon Days, it's about this miner who is, all his life he's been out west, mining. He's never struck it rich. And the assayer is trying to steal the rights to the mine, which is kind of ironic, since
Very ironic.
he lost the rights to the Lone Ranger. And here's this masked man who, and Tonto wasn't even in the picture yet. It was just the Lone Ranger and his horse Silver came and saved the man. Silver knocked over the chimney and found the hidden documents that prove that the miner was the rightful owner to the mine. And I think it resonated with people who were losing their farms and homes and getting their furniture repossessed, that, hey, there's somebody out there who, at least on my radio, is helping people like me. So I think the adults identified it with that way. And I think the children identified, just were taken with the romantic figure of that masked man on the big white horse with the silver bullets. So I think that's why it resonated with the children.
Now, this is a question about the book itself.
Okay.
So what genre would you say it's in? Because it doesn't really, it's not really a nonfiction. It's not really historical fiction.
Yeah, and that was a problem.
Magical.
That was a hard part. And I was trying to find a publisher because they said, well, or an agent. They said, well, what is this? Because it's part noir. There's a gangster element to it. It's biographical fiction, which I didn't even know was a thing, but evidently I wrote one. Historical fiction. It's a comic novel. There's magical realism in it. So it's a blending of genres. It's being marketed as a historical novel. But no one knows this yet. I'll announce it here. But this week it won the Firebrand 2023 Firebrand Award for biographical fiction. So
Congratulations.
So yeah, it's a mix of things, and I didn't set out to do that. There's like two types of writers. There's they call them the planners, who like plan things out and outline, and their walls are covered with sticky notes. And then it's called pantsers, and those are the people who write by the seat of their pants. I'm a pantser in all areas of my life. So I started out with this idea that I knew I wanted to write about him. I knew I wanted to write an adventure story about a man who wrote adventure stories. And I wanted to put it kind of like in the format of a radio play. So there's episodes that are titled, not chapters. There's a musical interlude in the middle. And I wanted it to be a fun book. And I was specifically thinking of Shoeless Joe by W.P. Kinsella, which Field of Dreams is based on, and The Natural, Bernard Malinwood's book. And of course, the movie was filmed here in Buffalo. Those are based in fact, but they are really creating mythologies and almost fairy tales. And I love that element of those books. And so I tried to do that in Yesteryear. So my mantra was, when I was writing the book, because I was thinking of those two baseball novels, is Swing for the Fences. And to me, that meant no joke is off limits. No sentence could be too long. No brushstroke could be too broad. Just try to be really creative and funny and see what happens. So I wrote like the first 25 pages. I knew it was much different than Muscle Cars or Rook. And so I have this group of writers, and I send them the 25 pages. And I said, look, it's the first draft. It's the first 25 pages. I don't even know if it's going anywhere, but it's really different. Don't critique it or anything like that. But just tell me, should I keep going? Because I didn't know. This was uncharted territory for me. And they all said, yeah, keep going. Let's see what happens. And I said, what happens? I go, I don't know. I mean, I know he's going to sell the rights, right? I know he's going to come up with something for the Lone Ranger, but I didn't know how to get from the beginning into the end. So I didn't set out thinking, oh, let's blend genres. That'll be cool. This is just what came out.
Can we talk about those? I'm looking at my notes here because further down I mentioned like the swinging from the fences parts to the story.
Yeah.
Like FDR and how did he get woven into the story?
So this is going to sound really nerdy, and I think I mentioned this the other night. When I do research for something like this, I'll go down to the central library and just get on the microfiche machine. The librarians have to set up for me because I still can't figure it out. And I'll just read the newspapers, not necessarily stuff about Striker or anything, but just to see what was going on in Buffalo in 1932. Look at the ads. They're hilarious. The prices are unbelievable. And I came across this article that FDR was coming through town as part of his, as a campaign stop when he was running for his first term. So this is 1932. And in the Courier, the Buffalo News, they published his itinerary, which would never happen today, right? For security reasons, when his train was going to arrive at the central terminal. What time? When he was going, this is the route he would take to the Statler Hilton. I guess it was just the Statler. This is the route he would take to the Statler. And they, but the streets, they laid out, where he was going to turn. He'll be at the Statler for dinner until this time. Then this is the route he's going to take to give his speech. Here are all the people that are going to be on stage with. All this was in this article. And I said, well, this is really interesting. What the hell? Why don't we have FDR in the book? Because there's already people, because of the nature of the story, that were real life people. Stryker had to be in it. Trendle had to be in it. John Barrett, who was a radio actor, he had to be in it. Why not bring in FDR? So instead of making a campaign stop, I made it that he was already the president-elect, because back then you weren't sworn in until March, not January like it is now. So he was president-elect. He wasn't sworn in yet, but he was making a stop in Buffalo. And there was going to be an assassination plot. And of course, Stryker and Barrett are my version of Lone Ranger and Tonto. It's one of their things to foil the assassination plot.
And how about those diamond rings?
So a lot of the stories, like Lefty the Dog Thief, the diamond rings, those are my father's stories. My dad was a great storyteller when my mom wasn't around, and he had a few glasses of wine. He would tell stories. He came from Greece. He would tell stories about growing up down in primarily the Greek section of town back then, which was Genesee and Oak. And my grandfather had a restaurant, and they lived above. And these were the characters that would come into the restaurant. So there was a boxer, wasn't Jimmy Slattery, who would come in, who was an alcoholic, which that's where I got the idea probably for bringing Slattery in later, who would come in and say to my dad, Ange, could you hang on to my diamond ring? I'm going to go drink it. And I'm not sure, I don't want to lose it, And the man would disappear for days, weeks. And he said, my father was the only honest man on Genesee Street. And my dad would hold the ring. He was just a kid. I mean, he was in high school, right? Or early 20s, before the war, anyways. And the guy would come back, and my dad would give him his diamond ring back. So that was my dad's story. So Jimmy Slattery, the former light heavyweight champion from South Buffalo, also came into my grandfather's restaurant. But by this time, you know, his fighting days were over. He was a terrible alcoholic, and my dad wanted to throw him out because he was bothering the waitresses. He was trying to chew their hair because the one was a strawberry blonde. He thought it was candy or something. So I said, wait a minute. I remember that. Let's put Slattery in it too. I don't know if Striker and Slattery ever crossed paths. But they were both in Buffalo at the same time, living here at the same time. So it's a novel, right? It just has to make sense in the context of the book. It's not a biography. So sure, Jimmy Slattery's his friend, and he's got 2 diamond rings that he wants Striker to hold. And of course, Striker loses them right away. And again, he and Barrett have to recover the stolen rings. So Slattery, Lefty, the dog thief, was a friend of my dad's, and this was during the Depression, and he would steal a lot of things, including dogs, and would sell them. And for years, I thought his name was Lefty because he was missing an arm. And I was talking to my uncle, who just turned 97 in September.
Oh.
And somehow we're talking about Lefty. It came up. He was reminiscing about the old days on Genesee Street. And I go, how'd he lose his arm? He said, he didn't lose his arm. I go, well, why'd they call him Lefty? He said he was from Greece. His name was Leftadios. Everyone called him Lefty. Oh, all right. I guess he's got 2 arms in my book now. All right. And so but that again, that was someone from stories I grew up listening to that found their way into the book. Again, not a conscious decision. I was just trying to be colorful and funny. So I stole my dad's stuff.
I'm sure he'd be proud of his stories work their way.
He would have gotten a kick out of it, I think.
And how about your research? You want to share? I know you talked a little bit about going to the public library.
Yeah.
Did you get into the archives?
Oh yeah, I'd go there, put on the white gloves, hold the scripts. A friend of mine was when she was in college, they had Fran's typewriter on display at UB. And she was, wanted to be a writer. And when no one was looking, she'd run by and rub it for good luck and get some creative mojo on her fingers. So I did a lot of research at UB, going through the cartons, a lot of research down at the library, because there was so much written about the Lone Ranger over the years. There was so much written about the early days of radio, which I really didn't know too much about. So I was reading those books, and you know how it is when you do research, you read an article and then you get to the end where they list all the citation page where they list the sources. You go, let me look up this article and let me look up this book. The 2 books that helped me the most were the biography of Fran Striker, written by his son, Fran Striker Jr. And it's a very thin book. It's called His Typewriter Grew Spurs. And that was a lot of kind of like inside information, because he had that relationship with his dad. And the other was the biography of Trendle, that was also very slanted, to make him look like he was a better person than he really was. So I kind of read that one with a jaundiced eye, but it did give a lot of interesting details that I was able to weave into the book. So I didn't set a date, like I'm going to do research from January to October, then start writing. I just did enough research until I felt, I describe it as feeling full. I felt like I had enough to get going. And so I would go and just start writing, and then would go, and if I got stuck, pull a book off the shelf or go back to the library and look something up if I couldn't read my handwriting on my notes, but I did most of the research before I actually started writing.
And did you have any interesting magical moments where things just came together? I mean, you said you were sort of dancing it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right word or not, but
The word now. Writing, Norman Mailer wrote a book on writing. He called it The Spooky Art. It was the name of the book, because stuff happens, things that you don't plan. It just, you just get the idea out of nowhere, or you go back and you read something you wrote the day before And it's like, did I really write that sentence? I don't remember writing that. And it's pretty good, spooky stuff happens. That's part of the idea that's being explored in the book. The biggest historical inaccuracy in the book is that I have Striker having writer's block, which he never had a day in his life. But I had him have writer's block because I want to explore, where do ideas come from? Where do stories come from? And the answer is it's all around us. We just have to be open to the ideas or be ready for them. It sounds kind of new age and, artsy, weird stuff, but it's kind of.
Hey, we're in an art gallery.
Yeah.
We get it.
Yeah. So I think that was true. So that's in the book. My moment was not writing, goofing off on Facebook. And there is a wonderful writer. She's from Niagara Falls. She lives in Louisiana now, named Karen Celestin. And we're friends on Facebook. And she's a Black woman, and she happened to post an article. And it says, was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger a Black man? And I just started writing the book. And I go, what? Why did she post this now? Right when I needed this. And so, of course, I read the article, and there was a man named Bass Reeves, who was a runaway slave. And according to legend, he stole a Confederate Army horse and rode out to the Oklahoma Territory. And when he was out in the Oklahoma Territory as a runaway slave, he lived with the Native Americans, the Indian tribes in the Oklahoma Territory. Learned to hunt, learned to fish, became an incredible marksman. And when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, he became a U.S. Marshal, a Black U.S. Marshal who would sometimes wear a mask to hide the color of his skin, and to help infiltrate gangs. He liked a big white horse, a dark figure on a white horse. He grew up spent time in the Indian tribes. He had a friend who was a Native American, an Indian. They pal around together, they ride around together. And instead of sending or throwing silver bullets when he left town, his calling card was silver dollars. So yeah, he's leaving town, he'd throw a silver dollar for someone to find. You brushed down his horse, he'd give you a silver dollar. So he became known for throwing silver and being associated with silver. And so this article and other articles made the connection that said, hey, this must be the inspiration for the Lone Ranger. Again, Striker didn't live long enough to write his autobiography, his memoir. Couldn't find anything to say that pointed to Bass Reeves. But I thought, well, this is a great story. So we're going to put Bass Reeves at least the legend of Bass Reeves in the book. But it was that aha moment, that spooky moment on Facebook when I needed something, and Karen posted it, and there it was. So that was my spooky point.
Did you set her straight?
I did. I said, why did you post this? She was, I just thought it was interesting, from a Black person's perspective on looking at history and pop culture. And so I just put it out there. And I said, I needed it. Thank you for that. And then, of course, there's been books written about Bass Reeves. And so the one I think I read, I think the title is called Black Gun, Silver Star. I think that was the name of one of the biographies that I read about Bass. But yeah, so in my book, again, it's fiction. I'm not claiming this is true, but in my book, in my created world of Fran Striker, and he was absolutely the inspiration for the Lone Ranger.
I'm going to ask if anyone else would like to ask a question or two.
I have two questions.
Sure.
The first is going back to the biography of Trumbull, and the fact that it was biased in a way that was not true. Who wrote that?
Oh, it's in the book. I don't know if it's in this because I got an advanced reader's copy. Yeah, it is called, or her name is Mary E. Bickle. And it's George W. Trumbull, an authorized biography. So, he authorized the book, obviously, that he was telling her, during the interviews.
Yeah.
And when I found it online someplace in Texas, and it shows up, and I open up the envelope, that it came in, and it still had the dust cover on it. The book came out in the early 70s, still had the original dust cover. And there it is. It says the biography of the authorized biography of George W. Trendle, writer and creator of the Lone Ranger Green Hornet. Oh. So even if you go and watch that awful Johnny Depp movie that came out, I guess maybe 10 years ago, of the Lone Ranger, if you make it through the end, when the credits roll, it will say, based on the characters created by George W. Trendle. So even, 10 years ago, it's still.
That's sad.
Yeah.
My second question is, do you by chance know where Striker is buried?
I do. I visited him. He's out in Arcade in the old cemetery, and you drive. It's a very narrow road, and you drive up to the top of this hill, and it looks out on a beautiful vista. It's striking. And there's it's a family plot, and they all have silver crosses. I don't know what the material is, but so he's there. His children are there. His wife. He still has family. He must have family in town, because I've probably been out there 4 times, and there's always flowers on the graves. So somebody still goes out.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Does the headstone or cross make any reference to
Nope.
the?
No, just and knowing how humble he was, it doesn't surprise me. It's just his name.
And
You have a question?
go ahead, Chuck.
First, quick question, and then a little bit longer one. Is there a plaque at the radio station for him?
I don't know.
Okay.
The radio station's moved. It's now on Kenmore Avenue.
Right.
I've written them a couple times saying, this is the 90th anniversary of the Lone Ranger premiere on your radio station. Do you want to have me on? I pitched it better than that. And nothing, crickets, no one responded, which is disappointing.
I actually have a comment. It's kind of
This is great.
crazy, but it's interesting that Trundle was in Detroit and Motown, and how many Black songs were stolen by white people.
Oh, sure,
So
yeah.
that's kind of not in your
Yeah.
story, but ironic. The other thing is the Colored Musicians Club. We're members.
Oh, love that place.
So how was your research done for that?
Drinking.
Hey, why not?
I used
Not
to,
spending much.
yeah, that's right. I used to love going on Sunday nights for the open jam
Mhm.
and just hanging out at the bar. And I just love that place. I'm anxious for it to reopen again. And I would just sit there and, I'd be by myself, and we just have a few beers, listen to the jazz, and just kind of take in the vibe
Mhm.
of the place, and try to imagine the way it may have been, 90 years ago.
One other thing, the elephant in the room, Magaddino.
Yes, so there is the mafia. This is the noir aspect of it. So Magaddino, head of the Buffalo crime family for decades, original member of the crime board, and he had funeral parlors. He was a licensed mortician, and his nickname was the Undertaker. He didn't call that to his face, but that's his nickname. And he was based on Niagara Falls, and he had a funeral parlor there, and there was a crematorium in the basement. And the joke was, during the Depression, the only thing that's working is the Undertaker's furnace, because if you crossed him, or if you were an enemy, you would just disappear. He would kill you and then put you in, cremate you, or bury two bodies in a single casket. I don't know how I stumbled across that. And again, it was not planned. It was like, that's too weird and of a good details. I said, he's got to be in the book, right? So let's bring in the Magaddino and put him in there. So again, nothing planned, flying by the seat of my pants. But it was there. I read an article when I needed it. I can't explain it better than that. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Bob, did you have a question?
Who owns the rights now? Do you know?
It was sold, NBC Universal actually owns it.
Yeah.
And it was sold as a package. So they bought a whole lot of other things besides the Lone Ranger rights. And that was a $3 billion sale. And the Lone Ranger was included in that. He didn't, I did an interview on Channel 2 over the summer, and they said on the news that, and then it was just sold recently, the Lone Ranger rights were sold recently for $3 billion. That's not right. It was part of the sale for $3 billion, but it wasn't just the Ranger, but Universal owns it.
And the Green Hornet was all in that package?
I
that this
don't
guy
know.
bought?
I don't know. I don't know.
But what's his name? The T name?
Trendle?
Trendle.
Yeah.
When he bought Ranger, he got Green Hornet, or those were all things
So
that,
what happened was the Green Hornet hadn't been written yet when he sold the rights to Lone Ranger. So now Stryker was an employee of WXYZ. So everything that he wrote, Trendle owned. So again, the Green Hornet, think of all the comic books, all the toys, the movies, the TV show, that's all goes to Trendle. Sergeant Preston, the Yukon wasn't as successful as the Green Hornet or the Lone Ranger, but it was still pretty successful, in its day. It didn't make that transition to TV like the Ranger and the Green Hornet eventually did, but yeah, so Trendle made a lot of money off of Stryker.
If you want to ask our online audience if they have any questions.
Sure, if anyone online wants to ask a question, just unmute yourself. You can ask.
I put them all to sleep.
I was gonna say, my dad just loved the Long Ranger.
Yeah.
He died recently at
Oh.
95. And I think one of the things that he enjoyed was that it was a nice, good, happy ending kind of story that you could depend on. It came every week,
Yeah.
and you could look forward to
Yeah.
it. So in those times, I think that
So
was.
Stryker actually wrote out, because eventually he had other writers working under him. He wrote out how this Lone Ranger should be depicted. He always has to use perfect grammar. He doesn't drink alcohol. The setting can't look like a saloon. It has to be a restaurant, like a diner, a food restaurant. So he wrote all this out, and he was very sensitive because he knew the kids loved the Lone Ranger. And he really wanted to make sure that he preserved how the Ranger was presented. And so he wrote out, this is how it's done. This is the playbook. Because he was really worried that it wouldn't be as wholesome, and somehow that would either disappoint or somehow hurt the children. So he was very conscious of that. And one of the, I think, problems with the Johnny Depp movie is they go away from the playbook, right? They didn't follow Stryker's rules.
Yeah, that's sad.
Yeah.
How many children did he have?
Uh,
He and his wife have?
I think 3 or 4. Yeah, I think 3 or 4.
I know, just like talk about you as a writer for a little bit.
Sure. I know the
So,
answers to these.
How long did it take you to publish that first novel or
The
the
first
first book?
Oh, 30 years.
30 years. That's
Yeah.
what I thought.
Yep, it was a long time. I started writing, I wanted to be a writer in high school. I read The Hotel New Hampshire by John Irving. Came out late 70s, early 80s. And I used to subscribe to the Rolling Stone when it was like a newspaper and cool. And they serialized Hotel New Hampshire in that. And my sister and I used to fight over who's going to read the latest excerpt from the Hotel New Hampshire first, and she would always grab it and lock herself in, her room, and I could hear her laughing, and I go, give me that newspaper. So when she bought me the novel for Christmas that year. And when I finished it, I thought, man, I want to write a book that's like that. You're laughing until you realize it's sad. I just love that whole idea. And so I went to UB, I took my first creative writing class, and then I got the bug. I said, this is what I'm going to do. It's like the only thing I'm even a little bit good at. And so when I went to Miami to get my master's in 86 in creative writing, this was the time that all these male American writers their first novels were coming out, all under 30. So Bright Lights, Big City, Bret Easton Ellis, Michael Chabon, all these people and I'm in class saying, well, I'm 26. I'm going to come out with my degree. I'll be one of those guys that has their first novel by the time they're 30. That's the plan. Can't miss. Then, my 30th birthday passed, and my 40th birthday passed, and my 50th birthday passed.
But you were writing.
Still writing, getting rejections, maybe a handful of stories published. I think I had three or four failed novels in the drawer and a failed short story collection. And so you alluded to it earlier. I went back for my MFA later in life. And though that program, and a lot of them are low residency programs now, so you only have to be on campus for 2 weeks out of the year, and the rest is done, over the internet. So when you have a family and you have a job that pays the bills, you can do something like that. And so that's what I did. And for whatever reason, something clicked there. I went there with 2 novels. One completed one, and that was called, what was the name of that? I'll think of it. And then another novel was half done. And my plan was it's a 2-year program. My first year, I'm going to work on this one. This already has a completed draft. And my second year, I'll work on the second novel. And by the time I graduate, I'll have 2 novels to send out to agents. That was the plan. So the first semester I was there, it was a comic novel called Rounding Third. And nobody laughed, which is not a good sign if it's a comic novel. That's okay. I'll switch gears. I'll put this one aside for now. And the second semester, I'll concentrate on Slip Kid. That's the name of the novel. And I already had that completed. And it was not a comic novel. But it wasn't good. It was not good. And my instructor was this wonderful writer called David Payne. He wrote Barefoot to Avalon. And I guess he got sick of reading it. And so I sent him my 25 pages that was due that month. And he did a very generous thing, but it was very painful. He edited it, a line edit, the way he would have edited the whole 25 pages in red ink. Cross this out, move this here, that. It looked like there was just blood all over the page. There was so much red ink, and it was crushing. It's like, look how bad I am, right? And so that summer, I really debated whether or not I should go back and finish the degree, because the plan was not working. But when I think if you're any type of creative person, that you can't get away. You can't say I'm going to stop writing, or I'm going to stop painting, or I'm going to stop drawing. It's something that drives you. So that summer, I decided, okay, I'm going to study these 25 pages that David Payne just marked up, and I'm going to learn from them. And my goal is going to be not to come out with 2 finished novels. It's going to come out to have 1 short story that's publishable. So that summer, I wrote a short story called Muscle Cars. And I went in that fall semester, and I was the only man in that, they call them pods, our little groups. It was Ashley Warlick was the instructor, and then there was 4 or 5 other women. And here's the short story about a guy who lifts weights in his garage, and he shaves his body hair, and he's just dealing with a lot of stuff, and they're gonna hate this, right? What am I doing here? Why am I wasting all this money on tuition? And so these settings, you can't speak. You have to sit there until the end. So they go around and they critique it in front of you, but you cannot respond until the end, right? And so you just got to sit there and take it. So I think I was like in this position, okay, start, and everyone loved that story. And I don't know, something clicked after that. I think studying David's comments, learning about what story meant, something clicked. And from that point on, I wrote 16 other short stories in a row. They were all published in literary magazines. And then it won the award from SFWP, and was published in a book form, Muscle Cars. So, but to answer your question, it took me 30 years to get the first book.
Your prof believed in you, or he wouldn't have given the time to it.
What's that?
Your prof believed in you, or he wouldn't have given the time to it.
Yeah, he was I tell him now, I think I thanked him in my author's notes for Muscle Cars. It was one of the most gracious and unselfish things anyone's ever done for me, to take the time. 25 pages is a lot. And to treat it like it's your own. he must have just been dying when he was marking it up. But funny that, so that Slip Kid, that novel that he did that, it stuck with me, that story. And so I whittled it down and it became a short story that's included in Muscle Cars. And then when I was done with the short story, I still couldn't leave it. So I said, I'm gonna write a screenplay, because all my friends were writing screenplays. So I can do that. So I got the software and I couldn't get a full length out of it. But I did get a short screenplay out of it. And that's what won the Denver Film Festival Award for short screenplay. So that was fun. But I couldn't make it work as a novel. And I probably wasted a lot of time working on that. I should have just put it away and done something else, but.
So you have another book that's ready to come out.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do next?
Yeah, so well, this is a funny story. We were talking about this before we started. I call it my pandemic novel. It has nothing to do with the pandemic, other than I started it right when we first locked down. And I was living here in the Elmwood Village in a big house with just me and my little one-eyed dog. And I was probably we were probably drinking too much. And the news was just too awful. You couldn't go outside, you couldn't go to the gym, you couldn't go to the Colored Musicians Club, you couldn't do anything. So I need to write something. And a lot of creative people I know, they couldn't write anything during the pandemic. It was just too awful. They couldn't concentrate. They just shut down. I was just the opposite. I turned off the TV and I said, I just need to create my own fictitious world where I'm sort of in charge. But people read to escape. I wrote to escape. So the novel it was pure escapism. It's a noir novel set here in Buffalo in the 1940s. It's called After Pearl, because it takes place after Pearl Harbor. And my detective is an alcoholic, and he has a little one-eyed dog, and he's lost everything. He's lost his agency. He's lost his secretary. He can't find his car. He's taken a job as the hotel detective at the Hotel Lafayette. And to him, that's like, it doesn't get any lower than being a house detective, right? And he wakes up on the floor of his room at the Lafayette, and he's been, like Slattery in my book, he's been on a bender. He can't remember anything for the last 5 days. It's just a blackout. But there's two bullets missing from his gun. His gun's been fired twice. And the police want to talk to him about a missing singer from the Chezamie nightclub that used to be on Delaware Avenue. And that's how the novel begins. So I wrote it, and I had this writers group, and they're all from Queens. Ashley, who was my instructor when I wrote that short story, Muscle Cars, she's a dear friend. I'll see her next weekend. I'll be in Greenville, South Carolina at her bookstore as part of the launch. I sent it to her, and that's, what do you think? And she goes, is this a series? And I go, no, it's a one-off. I wrote it during the pandemic, oh, no, I think it'd be a series, but no, it's good. It's good. I sent it to my friend Carla Dameron, whose new book comes out at the end of the month. She's a crime writer. I said, what do you think? She goes, well, first question, is it a series? And no, I wrote it during the lockdown. It's a one-off. No, I think it'd be a series. Like, no, just a one-off. And so I sent it to my publisher, and he goes, I love it. Is it a series? Because I think something like Netflix would be interested in this. And I said, yes. Then there was no other book planned before that. There was never going to be a sequel. It was just a one After Pearl that was done. So I said, all right, let's see if I could write another one about, Nicholas Bishop. That's named My Detective. And so I'm doing that now. I'm about 100 pages in. And the working title of that one is called The Falling Woman. So we'll see if that one gets past page 101.
We're gonna see you on Netflix.
Here's hoping, man, if you know somebody. But yeah, that's
Mr. Striker, don't let the family get in the way.
That's right. That's right. Sorry, kids. But that's what, After Pearl comes out in 2025. I don't have a firm pub date yet. And then we're shooting for having the sequel come out in 26 or 27, but I gotta do a lot of writing and the next year to make that happen. But that's what I'm working on.
And that's what you do full time?
Oh, no, I wish. I write from 5 to 7 every morning. I get up and
2 hours a day?
2 hours a day. Yeah. Yeah. And then I do my day job. But even when you're not at the keyboard, you're still thinking about, you're still writing. It's still, you call it pre-writing, whatever you want to call it. But I'm still thinking things over, even when I'm sitting at the Color Musicians Club or, you're still thinking, you're still working things over. I like writing at 5 in the morning. Well, first by necessity, because at the end of the working day, I'm too tired to get the creative energy to write. But I like, just waking up and going right to writing, because there's something about going from like the dream state to writing fiction where you're kind of creating your own dream world. There's some kind of weird connection there. And I found that sometimes if I read what I wrote the day before, right before I fall asleep, sometimes, doesn't happen often, but sometimes I'll be revising in my head. A sentence will get stuck in my head and I'll be going over it and over it and over. So even if I'm not in front of the typewriter, in front of the computer, stuff's still percolating when I should be doing my real job.
What is your real job?
I sell software, which is again, telling stories, making stuff up. Sure, it works like that. For years I sold software that ran warehouses. And then as part of my midlife crisis, I said, I don't want to walk through another warehouse again. And I switched and now I sell equally boring accounts payable software. So yeah, definitely two sides of my brain that I have to use for that job, but.
I think writing is your real job.
Yeah, well, people say, oh, they'll tease me at work, that writing's my side hustle. And I haven't told them yet that the day job is the side hustle. But that's the way it's in my mind, I think of it.
Well, thank you so much for coming
Oh, thank
tonight
you.
and congratulations
Thank
on your
you.
many successes. And
Yes,
we'll have you back.
I hope so.
After Pearl
After Pearl.
is in our hands.
All right.
So thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so
Thanks so
much.
much. And all of you.
All right. Good night, everyone online.
Well, I hope I didn't ramble.